Is tackling broken in Football Manager 2024? Bit of a bold statement out of the gate, but more specifically, is the tackling attribute actually functioning as intended? Does it actually improve a player's ability to tackle? It sounds like an insane question to ask, quite frankly, but there is method to this madness. Anyone who's watched me for a significant period of time now will understand I've noticed something in this game for the last few years at the very least, and it has continued into FM24. There is a statistical phenomenon present in the game that has led me to believe the tackling attribute may not be what it's all cracked up to be. So I've decided to do a little investigation on this front, and the results genuinely are a little bit surprising. That all said, I need to provide you with the context first and show you said statistical phenomenon. So here we are at the end of a simulated Premier League season. I've not influenced this at all. I've not been an active manager. This is just unemployed, simulated one season Premier League. So we need to go to Stats, Player Detailed, and then scroll all the way down to Defending, Tackles, Won ratio. Now that obviously spoiled who was at the top, and if I've edited this rightly, I'll have hidden players 2, 3, and 4 from you to just show you players 5 through 10, because players 5 through 10 are a little bit what you'd expect. This is the tackles won ratio sections. This is the how successful were they in the attempts that they made to win the ball. This isn't total number of tackles, of which obviously defenders in teams that face a lot of pressure tend to obviously come out on top. Defenders at elite clubs obviously face less opportunities to have a tackle than players at relegation threatened clubs. So this is the section that you probably expect those elite defenders to come out in top on, because whilst they might not make as many tackles in the first place, their tackle ratio should be high, being elite defenders and such. So those defenders at Manchester City, Liverpool, ones that challenge for the title, Ruben Dias, Virgil van Dijk, players like that, you'd expect to have a very good tackle ratio, even if they don't do as many tackles as, say, you can see here, 6th here, Tom Lockyer at Luton Town, because they obviously don't face as many. That being said, looking at the list even from 5 through to 10, Chalobah, Lockyer, Tomiyasu, Adam Smith, Josh Da Silva, and Christian Romero, few of those are top teams. I'm not sure you'd put any of them in the world-class, maybe Romero, world-class category in real life. There's no Ruben Dias, there's no Virgil van Dijk, etc. and so forth. So already there's a little bit of a discrepancy between the kind of players you'd expect to have the best ratios in the game and the ones that actually are. No disrespect to Tom Lockyer, the ones that are actually there. And then comes the real sticking point here, the players at the top. You saw Jack Harrison obviously led just by virtue of being on the side tab as the number one. He's only made 8 starts, but even so, winning 28 of 29 tackles is strong. Weirdly, Diogo Jota in this top 4 can be discounted from this particular line of thought, because if I highlight him, he has 9 tackling, which isn't awful. Ignore my colours. That is set up obviously for my non-league save right now, where everything above 13, I think, is regarded as good or great. So there's a lot of top tier colouring here. Apologies for that, but I'm not going to change it back just the one video. It's Zaniolo and Pedro Neto, our old friend. Go check out the Wolves beta save that we did if you haven't done so already. That kind of really illustrates where this has come from. Michele Zaniolo, 6 marking, 6 tackling, 94% success rate, 65 successful tackles out of 69, nice. And Pedro Neto, 75 successful tackles out of 80 made, 5 tackling, 5 marking. A player with 5 tackling has 75 successful tackles out of 80 attempts. Something is not right, either in the way that these are being marked or the attribute itself. So now to show you what I've actually done. This simulated season is actually the end of the first simulation I did, the control variables, which are 3 players from 3 different clubs who play in 3 different defensive positions. We have selected the 3 teams at the beginning of the year that were at 200 to 1 in the prediction season preview-wise, in that kind of lower mid-table block. Not the ones that were ultimately threatened with relegation or really going to be too high. Teams that are all in the same ballpark that will receive a little bit of pressure and therefore have to see a little bit of defensive duties. We have gone to Wolves and selected our old friend Max Kilman and given him 15 in everything that isn't a set piece, basically, of which we just sort of set them neutral at 10. Hidden attributes wise, we've given 20 professional and 1 injury proneness, just to make sure they try and avoid injury as best as possible. Otherwise, neutral across the board as well. Just try to keep them all as even as possible. So 15 in everything. And what we're going to do here is we're going to simulate this a few times. We've done 5 simulations of each. We're going to change tackling to 1, and we're going to change marking to 1 in separate attempts. Tackling, obviously. Marking, I just wanted to see what would happen on the tackling front if you put marking to 1. Because obviously marking influences how well someone tracks someone. So if they're in a better position to make a tackle, they might make more tackles, is what I was thinking. Obviously, that then does lead to the question of doing positioning as a 1, but might leave that to another video. But the main focus here, of course, is seeing what happens when you change tackling from 15 on these 3 players to 1. Now, it's Max Kilman, centre-back at Wolves, and obviously by virtue of doing this, making them all 15 across the board, also made both their left foot and right foot maximum because that helps the current ability. Just a side note, and a top tip, by the way, avoid improving people's weak foot in positions that don't really need a weak foot because it does actually take away from their ability points. Fullbacks, maybe don't bother with it because they can use those extra points to actually make attributes. But anyway, Max Kilman, centre-back, Wolves. Rico Henry, left-back at Brentford, and Chet Decore at Crystal Palace, who is a defensive midfielder and plays there predominantly. So, and obviously the way that we've set him up, he's made him into an excellent ball-winning midfielder. So that's where he's going to be playing for Crystal Palace. Like I say, Wolves, Brentford, Crystal Palace, all 201 in the season preview at the beginning of the year, so all in the same ballpark. Now to show you the results. We'll go through these one by one. I've hidden the results for the other 2 sections just for now, but control variables. This is 15 in everything, 15 tackling and 15 marking. Kilman, 82% thereabouts average tackle rate. Henry, 80.4, Decore, 76. So the defensive midfielder with a less successful rate of tackling. Fullback and centre-back not too dissimilar. I also included average number of tackles per game and the number of fouls they made over the course of the season, because obviously that is the number of times they were wholly unsuccessful in a tackle. The flip side, essentially. So per game, Max Kilman as a centre-back, 1.21 tackles per game. Henry, 3, thereabouts. Decore, 2, thereabouts. It is interesting that fullbacks make 3 times as many tackles as centre-backs, and the defensive midfielder more than the centre-backs as well. Number of fouls, however, Kilman, 24, Henry, 41, Decore, 48.6, so 49-ish. Kilman making just over half as many as the left-back, basically half as many as Decore, the defensive midfielder. Obviously, I don't have the data across the board for all centre-backs, all left-backs, all defensive midfielders, but this is indicative of the situation. It does mean that, effectively, centre-backs are not called into action defensively anywhere near as much as fullbacks or defensive midfielders, which in itself is interesting. However, 1 tackling. We're going to go backwards on this one. For Decore, no change in the overall average. 76.4, if anything, marginally better, but we'll put that down to statistical variance. Number of tackles per game, basically the same as well. Number of fouls, weirdly went down. That might be an anomaly. Weirdly, Decore got better at tackling technically with worse tackling attributes. He made 8 less fouls per year with 1 tackling compared to 15. One thing I think this already does actually highlight is fouls do not count towards failed tackles, I believe, which might be part of the issue when it comes to the wingers. Rico Henry, the left back, his average tackle rate went down by about 2.5%. His number of tackles per game, actually marginally higher, but about the same. And the number of fouls, only about 1 higher on average as well. So in terms of his actual defensive output, not a lot different, but his tackle ratio went down a smidgen. Could still be maybe put within the margins of error when you factor in the other 2 sections as well. But the fact that fouls went marginally up and his tackle success rate went marginally down, not a lot in it. It is Max Kilman where things get interesting here in particular, because it does make a difference for him at centre-back. 10% worse on average. His number of tackles per game went down from 1.2 to 1.07. It's not a lot worse when you can factor in the tackle percentage rate. And the number of fouls went up by 5, thereabouts, 4.5, 5. Taking a centre-back's tackling away from him does make a huge difference. Taking a full-back's or a defensive midfielder's tackling away from them, negligible or non-existent difference. That's for the marking. Setting tackling back to 15 and setting marking to 1 instead, turns out, makes very little difference to one's tackling ability. Max Kilman's tackle percentage with 1 marking, 82.6, basically the same. Rico Henry's tackling ability with 1 marking, 80.4, exactly the same. Decore's tackling ability, marginally lower, 74.8, but within statistical variance possibilities. The average number of tackles per game they made, again, basically in the same ballpark. 1.28 to 1.21, 3.00 to 3.01. Decore's 2.08 to 2.06. basically the same. The number of tackles they're making per game, with 1 marking and 15 marking, same. It's the fouls where things get fun with marking. Max Kilman makes, on average, 5 more fouls per year with 1 marking than he did 15. Rico Henry makes 6 more fouls per year with 1 marking compared to 15. And Decore makes about 3 more. So marking does make them more foul prone when it's lower. So what does this actually mean for tackling? And the answer is, I don't really know still. It seems like it makes a huge deal for centre-backs from Max Kilman. I might have to repeat this with more centre-backs. I'm certainly going to use these 3 players and change different defensive attributes and do a few more areas of defensive capabilities. I really want to do defensive positioning and anticipation for things like interceptions and see how much of a difference they make for that in particular. And I definitely want to do heading and jumping reach for heading capabilities to see how much of effect it actually has in this year's game, in particular on the heading one, because it has been obviously quite potent in recent years that tall players with good jumping reach really dominate. But for tackling here and now, I think more research might need to be done, because even though we did 5 simulations here, there is a distinct difference with centre-back Max Kilman, but none at all really for Henry or Decore, which does lead me to believe that tackling only matters for centre-backs, which obviously shouldn't be the case. So those wingers with their low tackling don't get factored into their tackling capabilities, essentially, was what started this, and I obviously now realise I haven't included a winger in this experiment, which I probably ought to have done. 2 conclusions I think we can make from this, ultimately. Yes, tackling does matter, but only for centre-backs. And 2, centre-backs don't do as much defensively as they probably ought to be doing compared to other defensive roles in the game. And this was a kind of a suspicion I had recently as well, particularly in draft mode and draft competitions. I hadn't put a huge amount of emphasis on getting those elite level centre-backs in drafts because I didn't really feel the difference between elite centre-backs and just sort of good centre-backs was noticeable, because I didn't think they really did much in Football Manager, and I feel like I might have just been proven right with this. The amount of times they're called upon, evidently, to do things is way lower than it is for the fullbacks and way lower than it is for defensive midfielders. So certainly more research to be done in this sector. And we'll be doing more, as I say, with other defensive attributes, positioning notably and heading notably, those 2 sections. I'm definitely going to be doing 2 more in this series, but I reckon there might be worthwhile doing a follow-up specifically on targeting centre-backs and their tackling attributes, because that is noticeable. And then maybe also introducing around with more fullbacks and around with more defensive midfielders just to see if it is the case across the board for these 3 positions. Because if it is, there's a problem. But that's it. I could prattle on for hours, but the conclusions have been drawn from this. If you've enjoyed this video and want to see more, then do like, comment, subscribe. You know the deal on that front. It just all feeds that mighty algorithm. But for now, thank you for watching. I'll see you soon for another one of these, probably. Until then, ta-ra.